say hope begins in the dark, but most just flail around in the blackness. The darkness, for me, is where I shine.
Chronicles of Riddick: Assault on Dark Athena is the sequel to Escape from Butcher Bay, again developed by Starbreeze Studios, and it was released in 2009 alongside the Escape from Butcher Bay remake, which both came together in a neat little package for the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, and Microsoft Windows. Now, whilst both games are practically identical in terms of controls and mechanics, a more cohesive and well-designed single-player campaign means that Assault on Dark Athena ends up being the far superior game out of the two. And despite a few niggling annoyances, it's a highly enjoyable experience with a dark, gritty sci-fi setting and one of the most badass protagonists of all time. Right from the opening scene, Assault on Dark Athena just oozes with high polish and production values. After a brief tutorial sequence and following on from the events in Butcher Bay, Riddick and bounty hunter Johns are captured by the mercenary ship, the Dark Athena. The captain of the ship is a woman named Gail Rivas, and it's heavily implied that there's some unresolved issues between herself and Riddick. After he gets onto the ship, Riddick soon uncovers a sinister plot where the mercenaries are harvesting dead bodies and turning them into combat drones which patrol the ship alongside Gail's mercenaries. From this point, you work alongside a bunch of prisoners trying to escape the ship, though of course things don't quite go to plan and shit frequently and fantastically hits the fan. Like Escape from Butcher Bay, the voice acting and sound design is just fantastic across the board. Props have to go to the guy who composed the soundtrack as well, which is this mix of orchestral and electronic that is really unique and great to listen to when you're blowing someone away with a shotgun. Visually, the game is also top-notch stuff with really detailed character models and impressive texture work. I'm not too sold on the depth of field effect, and some of the other post-processing effects make me feel like I've had too much to drink. But it does keep in line with the whole movie tie-in thing they're going for, and stylistically it's at least consistent with Escape from Butcher Bay. The animation during cinematics is much better here than it was in the prior game, with some genuinely enjoyable and engrossing cinematics, which do an amazing job of developing and causing you to care for certain characters despite only knowing them for a short period of time. Gail really does steal the show as the game's antagonist. She's just such an absolute badass, and the confrontation between herself and Riddick at the game's finale is suitably fitting stuff. But of course, you gotta give it to Vin Diesel for his portrayal of Riddick. I mean, it's kinda hard not to love this guy. He's got that whole asshole with a heart of gold thing down to a fine art. He's not quite as cold to other characters as he was in the prior game. In fact, he pretty much goes out of his way at certain points to help other people. But then again, that's kinda what makes him so endearing. He pulls through when he's needed most.
They'll know your last thoughts were with them.
Thank you.
And even the side characters in this game put in a really good performance, from well-known actors like Lance Henriksen to well-known video game actors like Steve Bloom and Nolan North. Both of the Riddick games truly do show off some of the best voice acting you're ever going to hear in a video game, and it just helps to make the game more cinematic and immersive.
Cap?
Don't call me Cap.
These side characters will be giving you your objectives throughout the game, and again there's a sort of hub system to the game world. After you've initially explored the ship, your central point is going to be the prison area, where you'll venture into new areas as you progress, often heading back to the prison area to get updated objectives. People who've played the prior game will know exactly what they're in for here, and truth be told, very little has been changed in terms of the base mechanics. Gameplay is largely still split up between exploration, stealth, and combat, where combat is again broken up between shooting and melee. Exploration is where you're just traversing areas of the ship, where the game will swap out often to a third-person perspective as you climb across ledges or up ladders. None of this stuff is all that groundbreaking, but it's good in the way that it gives you a much-needed respite from some of the more chaotic combat sections. Again, like Butcher Bay, the shooting controls during combat aren't really as polished as they perhaps could be, and firing weapons can be a bit clunky at times, but it is at the very least functional. Most of the weapons returned from Butcher Bay. You've got the assault rifle, the shotgun, and the tranquilizer gun, and there's new weapons in the form of a submachine gun, which is just like a faster firing version of the assault rifle. And then there's something called the Scar gun. Now the Scar gun fires out these remotely detonated rounds you activate with the right mouse button. You're also free again to shoot out most light sources, giving you an edge over your opponents, but later on in the game, enemies will be equipped with night vision or flashlights, making this kind of redundant. There's a couple of sequences where you hop into a mech suit or get to remotely control a drone and wreak absolute havoc, which give the shooting a much needed breath of fresh air. The sequence where you're controlling the drones is easily one of the coolest moments in the entire game. Now the melee combat again can also be a little bit janky. It again works off a counter system where you try to time your strikes to deliver a devastating counterattack that can kill an enemy in 1 or 2 hits. Now this is fine against normal opponents, but when you're up against the boss type enemies it just doesn't work for some reason, and you really have to exploit their AI to get behind them or attack them from a vantage point where they're unable to reach you. Also, certain weapons can't block other weapons, so a combat knife can't block a club, which makes sense now the more I say it, but you'll only really figure this out after you've been beaten to death a couple of times. And lastly, there's the stealth, which revolves around crouching in the shadows, using Riddick's eyeshine or night vision ability to see where you're going, and stabbing unaware enemies in the back with sharp pointy things. When you take out one of the drones, you're able to pick their weapon up and fire at nearby enemies, which never gets old. I found the stealth areas in Dark Athena to be much more well designed and streamlined compared to Butcher Bay. I mean, it always seemed like I had multiple paths to take, especially in areas where there was half a dozen bad guys I was trying to avoid. And even if you are detected, you're usually given the option to fight your way out, and it's often more fun to just do that, favouring the old guns blazing approach to crouching around in the shadows like some kind of futuristic Sam Fisher. And streamlined is really the key word here. Dark Athena just feels like a more well-rounded game on the whole. Whenever it gets to that point where you start getting bored of doing something over and over, the game will shift gears and throw some kind of new mechanic at you to switch things up. Whether it be some kind of mini boss fight or a new weapon to play with, or just mixing it up between stealth and combat, it really never loses a beat. From the moment I started playing, I just wanted to keep playing until it was all over, but in the best way possible. I mean, it's one of those games that makes you forget that the rent is due, or that you still haven't put the clothes out on the line. Now look, I did have some issues with the game though. Yes, I know you're thinking, here he goes again, complaining about shit that doesn't matter. Well, for starters, I thought the game was too short. Now some people claim the game took them 10 to 12 hours to get through, but for me it took me the better part of 4 to 5 hours. Now this isn't really a bad thing though, in the sense that the campaign is tightly crafted from start to finish, so every bit of those 4 to 5 hours is action packed, but it still could have used a bit more gameplay to round it out. The ending kinda comes out of nowhere too, not in terms of it being surprising, but in the sense that you beat the final boss, there's literally a 20-second cinematic and then it all just ends. Which is odd considering how much polish is in the other cinematics. Also, unless I missed something, they don't actually tell you what happens to Johns either. You see him a couple of times in some cinematics, but then never again. Maybe the intention is to make another game tying everything in with pitch black, who knows. There's a few other issues I had with the last third or so of the campaign. They really do all but force you into combat for the last couple of hours, and they make you fight this large alpha drone that can only be damaged with the Scar Gun. And this happens like a dozen times, which just becomes monotonous. This is also another game that uses a horrible checkpoint system. Now look, Sonny Jim, I'm not against checkpoints or anything, but if a game is going to include them, they need to at least be consistent. Sometimes you'll get a checkpoint every time you enter a new room, then sometimes you'll take on a couple dozen bad guys in a gunfight, then head into a new area against another dozen bad guys with no checkpoint in between. It's horse shit. I would never call Butcher Bay or Assault on Dark Athena perfect games, but in terms of movie tie-ins, which they are in a sense, they don't really come much better than this. Like most Starbreeze Studios games, they both tell a gripping, mature, and well-written story with believable characters, superb voice acting, and gameplay that more than does the job for the most part. And the fact you're getting both of these games in one is pretty damn good bang for the buck as well. And again, just to reiterate, this is a game where you get to play as Richard Goddamn Riddick. A guy so bad that he kills motherfuckers with a teacup, and I don't know any other video game protagonist who can make that claim to fame.
The monsters, they'll catch me.
Now the monsters have something to fear.